It is always great to be with folks from New Jersey, and I have to say I was at this event 2 years ago. One big difference this time is the traffic really wasn't bad this morning, and I didn't pay any tolls, and neither did any of you. I hope, depending on where you were headed. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and share a few slides that I've got. Let's see, and I trust that's. And Ashley, you'll let me know if it's not. So here's where we started out. The topic is over there on the left, expanding the circle of learning in accreditation, with the subtitle on the right, partnering for meaning. And I just have to say I've been enjoying this conference so much. This has been a great day of learning, and especially starting out with Linda Susky this morning. So I've just been thinking about this all along. Let me make sure that, there we go, good. It'll move ahead for us. So I'm going to start out with just some little introductory things, and then tell you a little bit about AQUIP's origins, our growth, our values, and then our expectations, standards, and evidence, and think about partnership, assessment, and learning. They're actually all going to be kind of woven together. But here was the starting point for the whole thing. The starting point for the whole thinking, I guess I'll start out on a personal note, really, was I started out as an accreditation skeptic. That might surprise you if you know my sort of history working for every acronym in the accreditation business almost. But when New York State first mandated accreditation, so all of us in New York, I was teaching at New York institutions at the time, leading programs there. I was one of those skeptics that said, why do we need to do that? What's going to be the value? What's the gain? Basically, what am I going to learn from it? And I was quite skeptical, actually. Nonetheless, the beauty of regulation is sometimes it brings us into learning we hadn't anticipated doing. So engaged with TIAC at the time, and came out feeling quite differently about the process after we'd gone through it the first time, recognizing that we did have a lot to learn, and valuing the process a lot. And yet, those of you who have engaged in accreditation work, and I'm guessing all of you have in many ways over the years, you know that it's a lot of work, it's a lot of evidence, and if you ask the question, how wide is the circle of learning? Sometimes the answer is narrower than we would like it to be. We learn a lot. The site visitors that come learn a lot. Those of us who serve routinely as site visitors for accreditation, we do so in part because of what we gain from getting insight into other programs. But can we widen that circle? That was where I started in my thinking. And as you'll see, I just jotted some notes here this morning, listening to Linda and listening to Felician's presentation and other presentations as well. I've got a little different subtitle I think I'd like to use, but I'll introduce that later. But right now, in the chat, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like you to just think for a minute and maybe put some responses in. The main question is on the left: what makes you proud of your work with local school partners? And there's some other supplemental questions there on the right. Who are your strongest partners? How are they integrated into the program? What ways do you actually work together? How are they connected to the assessment system in your program? And what are you all learning together? And so the story I'll start with here, I hope some of you will share a little bit as you think about what makes you proud of the work you do with partners. Okay, well, I'm not seeing anybody dropping things in the chat yet, but maybe you're still thinking about it. And one of the questions to consider is, how does your work in accreditation or work in assessment actually support and interact with this? In other words, does accreditation help make your partners stronger? Thank you. I see some things popping in. And by the way, the subtitle that I'm wanting to put in place for this presentation, if I do it again, I think is learning is a two-way street. And I'll tell you a little bit more about why later. So I'm just gonna pop on here and give you a little bit of background, and hope you'll continue keeping a discussion going in the chat. That's something, by the way, the two-way street thing, that I learned from working with some teachers in California. I do a little bit of online teaching now and then with some assessment classes for practicing teachers, just to keep in touch with what's happening in schools and to keep refreshed. And I've learned an awful lot about doing these kinds of online presentations from talking with teachers who've been teaching this way for the last year. You probably have as well. that's part of the two-way street. So real quickly, just a little background on AQUIP. We were founded in 2017, as Ashley said. There's where we've grown so far, and I'll tell you in a minute about some of the hallmarks of our assessment system as we dig into this question of partnership and assessment. But here's just a little story from the beginning. As AQUIP was getting started, it's kind of a fun thing to take out a blank sheet or a blank screen and try to design an assessment and accreditation system together with colleagues from across the country. And that was a wonderful experience to have. Early on, as we were doing our initial thinking about annual reports, we had this thought in mind: who's learning as we do the accreditation work, and who could learn? How could we benefit by expanding the circle of learning, although we weren't using that framing yet. And we started a conversation this way. If you wrote an annual report, who could that annual report be useful for? Is it just for accountability to standards through an accreditor? Of course, that's part of it. Does the annual report actually help move you forward in your own internal work? We'd hope so. But then we asked the question as well, would anyone else be interested in reading it? Could you imagine writing an annual report that your local school partners would be interested in reading? And two of the folks on the group that was putting this system together said, well, let me contact one of my closest school partners and ask what they would like to see. The answer that came back was really, really interesting. The answer that came back from both was, we just like to know more about what you do, because we don't understand really what happens in teacher preparation, even though, of course, these were folks that had gone through teacher preparation as well. And I've had some subsequent conversations about this, that as we think about our partners, the opportunities for mutual learning are really, really, really great. So I'm going to tell you just a little more as we thread this theme through, just a little bit more about AQUIP. You can see there our vision and our mission. I won't read those to you, but this is what we're committed to: promoting and recognizing quality educator preparation. Well, I'm going to read one of them to you. That strengthens the system's ability to serve all students, schools, and communities, and to do that equitably. Here's some values that guide us as we're doing it. And I'm only going to call attention to the one in the middle that's underlined there. And happily, this is now part of the discourse of accreditation policy and practice across the country. I'm very happy that this is getting more emphasis through CHIA and through U.S. Department of Education efforts as well around accreditation, to recognize and respect the importance of context as we're doing our work in accreditation. Here are a few things about the system. I didn't want to give you the whole rundown on our system, but if you're curious, these are some things that characterize it. And there's a link down there at the bottom that you can take in quickly to get a look at our guide. Our new 2021 guide for accreditation is available there. Those are just a few things. But now let me talk about our standards and about that questions of how we interact with the importance of context, and how we therefore think about meaningfully widening the circle of learning and learning together, or making learning a two-way street with our school partners. Some of you have seen this presentation before. I'll give you the short version here, just to highlight one point. First of all, our standards, we've got 4 of them. You can see them there. I'll show you another slide that has them a little more legible. That's a little small print there. Our standards are about 2 things. They're about completer performance, and they're about program practice. Those are the column headings. But they also operate at 2 levels, or on 2 dimensions, the column headings down the left-hand side there. The top row, 2 of our standards, represent the fact that as a mature field of professional practice, there's a lot of things that we agree on. There are a lot of things we know are important. There are a lot of things we know how to measure. There's a lot of measurement we know how to interpret. There's a lot of things we don't have to spend time wondering about. We wonder about them. We want to make them better. But they're the foundational expectations in our field. But we also have, the bottom row, we also have areas of growth in our field. We're a dynamic field. We're a field that's still learning. We're a field that we realize whatever we're doing, we're always doing it in a context. We're always doing it with partners. We're always doing it with a particular student population, hopefully a broad one that we're able to bring in and to serve. And we're working with particular partners. And so our things that we have to do, our quality, one could say, is always contextual, right? Just to borrow a phrase from Tip O'Neill, I guess, quality is always local. And so our standards recognize that as well. Here they are in 4 quick statements. And just so you know, just so you have them there. But the thing I'll point out is our partners, going to go into more detail. Our local partners are important for all of it, and therefore how we think about data collection and management with our local partners is important. So here's standard one. The architecture of our standards, by the way, they all begin with a statement. You're getting the bulleted versions here. Of course, if you go to the guides, you'll see them with much more language. But the architecture is we have 4 standards. Each standard has 6 aspects. And so here are the 6 aspects of standard 1. And we have particular evidence requirements. Here's where partnership begins to come in a little bit bigger way. Our evidence requirements are that we have to have multiple measures. No surprise there. We know that any one measure isn't going to give us everything we need. So we need multiple measures, and those measures have to represent multiple perspectives. And notice the underlining and bolding here of 2 of those perspectives says our partners, both our partners in the program as we're working through the program, and those external partners, maybe the same people, also different people who hire our graduates, and the places where our graduates work and the places that our graduates shape are also perspectives that have to be represented there. And in addition, we put a high priority on direct measures of performance in a clinical setting. So of course, that also is going to engage and represent our partners' perspectives. So as we think about accreditation in the AQUIP system, we're seeing we are clearly making meaning together. And if we approach that from a perspective of partnering, I think it's useful to think about the fact that our conversations with partners can ask 2 different kinds of questions in a quality assurance context. The first question is the one that we're maybe most used to asking. How did we do? How did we do in preparing teachers? The teachers that you've hosted, or the teachers that you've had in your building as interns, or the teachers that you've hired. And we can extend this, by the way, to the principals and to the school librarians, school counselors as well. I'm thinking about teachers here as the largest part of our enterprise in most cases. But there's a second question we can ask as well once we open these conversations. What could we do now? What should we do now? How can we keep current together to support students and teachers? It's the possibilities question. And so within the AQUIP accreditation system, because we're committed both to quality assurance or accountability as one dimension of the work, but also to a peer engagement, collaboration, and improvement agenda as the other part of the effort, we think that this way of thinking about how we work with our partners can be very significant. So I'm just showing you again, here are those aspects of standard 1. Of course, these are the things that we've been working on as a field for a very, very long time. And so you see, well, evidence from our partners is needed on each of these things. And so, here's just another question. How much of the evidence that you're using in accreditation do your partners help you answer? Then we come to the second question, though. How are they involved in interpreting the results, in helping to make meaning, or engaging in making meaning, not necessarily helping, but making it a joint collaborative enterprise? So let's go along. Then when we think about AQUIP standard 2, which is the outward reaching completer standard, which says, hey, after completers are out there, they need to go on growing, they need to go on adapting, they need to go on engaging local school and community culture, caregivers and families. They need to engage with culturally responsive and sustaining practice with diverse groups of diverse learners as populations change and as their service expands to different places. You can go on down through all of these. So, and this evidence, it's the completers and employers evidence is needed for all of it. Notice, depending on which way we're asking the questions, how rich the conversations can become. So I'm just kind of reiterate in different iterations, bringing these questions back. Notice that even for the first question, how did we do in preparing the teachers we've hosted and hired? We have to have some common shared professional judgment about what the meaning is of the data we're using on that, don't we? If we're going to ask the question, answer the question, it's not, we're not just sending out and getting back. It really has to be nested in a conversation. And to the second question, what could we do, right? If we can build on what we're gaining through these interactions, well, what evidence would be useful to look at and think about? What form does that evidence look like? And so I'll put that question down at the bottom, another one for you, and go, please carry on the conversation in the chat if you like, or we'll pick up the conversation at the end. Is there a way to assure that we and our P12 partners understand new teacher performance in the same way, so we can give consistent feedback and so that we can decide what it is that we're building towards. Lots of questions here. So here's just a proposition for you to consider. It might be the development of shared professional judgment could be the most important aim we could have in a quality assurance system. And it might be key to part of what Marilyn Cochran-Smith and her colleagues wrote about in their Reclaiming Accountability book. And it might be key to getting the public confidence in our work that needs to be there. Well, as you ponder that question, and hopefully we can talk about it a little bit at the end, I'm going to move on and sort of look at the other two standards in the AQUIP system. So the first two we looked at were the completer performance standards. The second two are the program practices standards. And notice I've bolded a number of standards here. This is standard 3, that the program has the capacity to ensure that its completers meet standards 1 and 2, which means that they perform effectively as professional educators right out the gate, and that they continue to grow and develop as professionals along all the dimensions outlined in the 6 aspects of standard 2. So standard 3 says we have to have what it takes to do that. And what is that? Well, here are the 6 aspects of that. These all look familiar to you. I'm sure they're the things that we're engaged in already. But notice I've got 4 of them bolded. If we're going to have quality clinical experiences and documented and effective partnerships, well, we're going to be in conversation with our partners about what makes those partnerships effective. And that's where learning is going to have to be a two-way street, because it's going to have to be effective from all parties. We also need to engage our stakeholders. This is the Baldrige criteria standard, or aspect 3C here. Engage our stakeholders in those improvement processes, sharing data, looking at planning together. And hopping down to 3E, in order to engage in our internal quality assurance, continuous improvement, quality assurance efforts internally with solid evidence, we need the help of our partners in that as well as in having the capacity to provide the experience. So notice how deeply our partners are engaged in that. Just to kind of make it through all the standards here and then come to some other questions, here's our 4th standard. And this is the one that I think, again, it's the contextual standard under program practices that says our program practices have to strengthen the P20 education system. We have to pay attention to local needs. We also have to pay attention to our particular mission. Shout out to the Felician University group that tied these two things together so powerfully in their presentation. So as part of working through these standards, we need to be gathering evidence, but we do it through the evidence as well, of engaging with our stakeholders to support schools to reduce disparities, of supporting a diverse educator workforce and at the same time addressing state and local workforce needs, and of supporting our completers as they go into the field. So our partners are critically important in working on this. So as we think about partnership, how does evidence play a role in that? What evidence can we share? How will we decide what it all means? So here's some of the fun. I'm going to tell you just a couple of little examples here as we move towards having a broader discussion. What we've seen in terms of this engagement, and I'm going to refer back to what Linda Susky said this morning, and I'm not sure if I'll find it quickly enough in my notes, but where she focused on doing analysis that actually has meaning and that actually can broaden the learning that's going on, and about reliability and validity that maybe is, here we go, I'm kind of paraphrasing her, that's less about the what of advanced statistical methods, even though solid measurement is important, and when the numbers are large enough, as Linda pointed out, the numbers are often small, especially when we get down to the program level. Certainly use all of the strength of statistical analysis that is warranted, but at the same time, let's make sure that it's less about the what and more about the who and more about the so what. So if we think about it that way, AQUIP members that have been going through the process have been doing some fascinating work where they've worked with their P12 partners as key partners in doing local validation of the measures that are used. and in bringing in those local partners to be part of the calibration of ratings. And really, the result of that has been the development of shared professional judgment that opens the way for conversation rather than just data swapping, but actually opening the way for conversation that's going to ensure consistent and meaningful feedback to candidates, to the program, to the schools. And growing from that, it lets us work more strongly together on another dimension of that fourth standard, that we can actually assure that new teachers are supported and school needs are met. AQUIP members have been able to engage with the partners based on those conversations about evidence to really customize aspects of courses, to put things in place that are going to be directly relevant to the candidates as they're in those field placements, to really multiply the learning together, but to also have it go both ways, to bring new things to the schools and to the conversation in that way as well. But in many ways to continue to engage community members. I'll tell you, one of my favorite examples that grew out of this was that in one local school partnership in one of the boroughs in New York City, where the partnership developed to the point where parents from one of the partner schools came to the classes to help students understand along that dimension of culturally responsive and sustaining education, what that would mean and how they would work together. And in process, gained a whole new engagement with the system. So we're seeing incredibly dynamic work, always empirical work, always looking at how we interact around assessment and around evidence, but in ways that are promoting this kind of partnership. Here's just an idea to throw out for you. I know some of the folks who are listening were probably at AERA last week. And you might recall AERA's traditional formulation of research as complementary methods of disciplined inquiry. I think this idea of engaging with partners touches on this as well, because AQUIP is going to be building out this argument that where accreditation really fits as a type of disciplined inquiry is within the evaluation research paradigm. And so if we think about the program evaluation standards for research and the improvement science model of innovation and improvement, you'll note, if you run back through those in your head, that both of those emphasize meaningful engagement at a local context and clear definitions of meaning and incremental goal setting, so that we're really clear about the path. Once again, an echo to Linda Susky's marvelous keynote this morning, of being clear about where we're going and being able to measure the steps along the way with evidence that's good enough to help us make the move, rather than thinking about the evidence and evidence quality as something separate from the action. It's integral to the action as we're moving along. So, and I have been hoping we'll have a good deal of discussion, and I'll move my slide to see if I can get a sense of how many folks are in the room. I guess we have a fairly small group, so I think we can perhaps even in just a couple of minutes, either through the chat or even go ahead and make yourselves visible so that we can talk. I'm going to tell one more little story, and then I think I only have a couple slides left, and we'll be ready to do some conversation or to back up and see anything you'd like to see. So I'm sure you know this old thing. When you find a turtle on top of a fence post, what's the one thing you know for certain? Well, you know for certain it didn't get there by itself. And I'm going to tell just a story from an actual accreditation case that's making its way through our system right now. I was reading the self-study report, and the self-study report was noting that work with local advisory board was sort of in development, but hadn't developed very far. But as I read through the report, I also read this. I read that the program had, in the last 3 years, developed a program whereby every one of their elementary and middle school candidates spent time as a resource to students in local schools to help them with their learning. Through school, sometimes in the school day, sometimes in after school, sometimes through different programs. And when the COVID crisis hit and the schools went virtual, the folks at the university had turned this program into a web-based learning support system that any teacher or parent could access and make connections with teacher education candidates in the program to support student learning. And as I explored that website and looked at the evidence, we had a conversation. And I said, well, you're sort of indicating that you're Partnership development work is still a work in progress, and feeling like it's not where you want it to be. But let me ask you about these programs, about this connection. How many of your candidates participate in this support for learning in response to local needs with students? How many were doing that before the pandemic hit? And the answer was, oh, every single one of them. And mostly, it's a continuous thing across the 2 or 3 years that they're in the program. I said, wow, that's fantastic. And I said, well, and what's the level of participation since you had to go virtual and do this on the web? And it was almost universal, very consistent, ongoing. I said, and are people happy with what's going on? Oh yeah, it's our friends in the schools just love it. I said, well, okay. And I brought out the turtle on the fence post, and I said, you may be saying on the one hand that the mechanics of an advisory system are still being developed, but how'd you get these set up? You didn't just walk into the schools and do it. And so what unfolded was a narrative of strong engagement with regional bodies that bring multiple districts together, with individual districts, with individual schools. And so the story was deep and meaningful engagement with local school partners to meet the needs. And I said, well, and what are you learning from it? And the answer was, well, we've got some evaluation we've been doing. It's not really formal, but it's helped us know what to do in making some changes, making some improvements. So I think sometimes, just like as in our work with data quality, and that's very important work, our work on reliability and validity and trustworthiness and freedom from bias and fairness in assessments, that's important work we need to do. We can make it a task unto itself and lose its connection to the overall system. So too, I think if we think about partnerships in a way that prioritizes the mechanics of formal structures, we can sometimes lose track of what's going on and the value of the work that we already have in place. So what I would hope we can do now, knowing that the presentation didn't take quite as long as it might have, I'm going to stop sharing. And Ashley, I'm going to see if you'd like to jump back into the to the screen here and invite. So maybe you've been seeing some things in the chat that would be a good place to start, but also invite everyone to please put some questions in, but also to share some of the valuable things that you're doing. And it looks like we've got about 16 people here, if I'm reading that right. So if folks wanted to unmute themselves for a bit, that could probably work as well, but I don't know the tech platform, so I shouldn't mess with that. So Ashley, guide us in our next few minutes here.
Sure, absolutely. So yes, there's 16 folks with us today. Folks, if you'd like to leave comments in the chat or questions in the Q&A, or I'm going to look in both places. But as Mark shared, I do invite you to join us just to have a conversation. It is a small group. So if you click the add, there's this blue button at the top where you can enable your video and audio. So if you want to go ahead and add yourself to the screen, you can just click that blue button on the top right. But Mark, maybe we want to go back to some of the questions that you had threaded in throughout your slides, because those were some really great questions that I was pondering, and maybe that would be a good jumping off point because I don't see any questions. Oh, I do actually see a question that just popped up. So maybe we'll actually start there. So Norma states, what kind of evidence is used for standard 1? Are there things required, or do we choose the evidence that we feel best supports a standard? TIAC was more had a more inquiry-based approach versus having things specifically expected to be included, as is done in CAPE. Can you comment on that?
Sure. Thank you, Norma, for that question. There are no specifically required evidence sources within the EQUIP system. Instead, what there is a heuristic, right? And that heuristic is you need multiple measures, and you do need them from multiple perspectives. Now, in practice, it's very common for people to use some very common measures. All of our states have license test requirements. That's a point of evidence. It's not required to be used, but because it's publicly available information and required, it is in the picture somewhere. It depends on how much you want to rely on it. But you know, our systems, we really have a tradition of gathering evidence in a lot of ways. So we're more concerned about the perspectives being represented. And there's a couple slides I could have thrown in that I didn't. So thank you for this question. It'll give me a chance to talk about it. So within the program, you've got probably more evidence than you know what to do with from the program. So our guidance is to say, well, pick what's going to give you the most useful picture of what's going on and be most helpful in making program improvements. So that's perspective number one, is the program faculty's own evidence from within the program. We always have evidence from our P12 partners, and I think that probably doesn't vary a lot because we're always concerned with the performance of our candidates and with the views of that performance from our P12 partners. So the evidence has to be there, but it's up to you what you want to use. I'll say another thing, by the way, our evidence system is flexible. So if you're doing one thing this year and you say, wow, I'd rather switch next year to using the CPAST or to using the FEAT, a couple of new student teaching evaluation systems that are gaining more currency, our view is go ahead, because the best time to change to what you think is a better measure is as soon as you figure it out, and let the data record just sort of show what happened. So those clinical partners' perspectives definitely have to be there. It's when we come to the question of the program completers and their employers' evidence that folks are getting most creative. As a field, we've tried to do a lot with surveys in recent years, and as a society, we're becoming so survey saturated that the response rates are often very difficult to hold up. So that's one toolbox. AQIP's guidance on everything, but particularly in relation to finding out information from our completers and about their performance and finding out from employers and local school partners, is to say we have a whole educational research toolbox available to us. And so go ahead and use the qualitative measures. I saw, by the way, someone had said, wow, we'd have, in the chat earlier, said maybe we'd have more of a two-way street if we had deeper relationships with specific partners. This is really kind of how you get that two-way street, because one of the things that qualitative research teaches us is not every informant is going to give us information of the same level of detail, value, thoughtfulness, simply because they don't have the experience, not a criticism of everybody. If we send out anonymous surveys, we get back anonymous data. We don't know whether the person who made the response is deeply knowledgeable about our program and our graduates, or is only moderately or minimally. If you know who your key informants are, though, and you can get interviews, focus groups with a few of those key people to get both questions answered, those two questions I posed earlier, how did we do and what could we do, right? The accountability question and the possibility question. That is a strategy that many of our members have been employing. They've also, I'll just say one other thing, because I see some other things are coming through here. They've also been trying, surveying students, doing the release and try to catch version of surveying is kind of hard. So our members have been using developing panel studies, right? Where they identify some candidates who, before they leave, they say, would you stick with us for 3 or 4 years to give us feedback on how things are going as you go into your career? Could we stay in touch, and would you meet with us once a year? And some are doing that individually with interviews. Some are doing it in focus groups of bringing people back together. And they've only, we're a relatively young agency, so folks have only been doing this for a couple of years. But finding that maybe knowing about the trajectory of development of a smaller group of candidates and completers that you can keep in touch with might be more valuable than, a series of annual snapshots where you're not really sure if you're catching the same people and getting the evidence at once. So I hope that's Norma, I hope that's a good answer, and please put additional follow-up questions in the chat if you'd like to.
Thanks, Norma. We do have another question, Mark. Susan asked, with regard to non-teaching programs, are the standards the same?
They are. They are the same. We only have one set of standards for initial or advanced or for other school personnel. And they are stated in a general enough way. So, well, actually, I won't bring it up, but I'll just kind of go through it and you'll probably remember what was there. If you think about standard 1, actually, I'll look at it over here so I don't miss any of the pieces. If you think about standard 1, it's easy to read it as it addresses initial teacher preparation, right? We're interested in content, pedagogical, professional knowledge, learners learning theory. I could go down the list, but I won't. If you think about preparing an administrator, the question is, how is that relevant for them? And it's less about content and pedagogy, more about the professional knowledge that's added. So that's the first point. But if you think about learning theory, social emotional learning, that's important for administrator to understand as well, from the perspective of supporting a good instructional program and supporting teachers. If you think about cultural competence and culturally responsive and sustaining practice, administrators need to be as aware of that as a teacher does. I'm thinking of principal and superintendent preparation programs now, less from the perspective of necessarily being in the classroom, but from the perspective of being able to provide guidance and coaching and monitoring to ensure that the school is meeting those kinds of goals. Same thing with assessment and data literacy. Same thing with creating a positive learning or work environment. And that aspect is stated that way to emphasize, well, it's about the learning environment in the classroom, but it's also about the work environment that teachers co-create together and that school building teams co-create together. And Susan, I hope that's a good answer, and please, elaborate on it. But the general answer is yes, in some way these standards are appropriate to every kind of program, and we've had school counseling programs use them as well, school psychology programs. With a little, with very just a little bit of thought about what kind of evidence and how it plays into the role works well. I'm also excited to say that next week we're doing our first site visit where a group of doctoral programs have decided to work with these standards and pull their programs around the standards as well. So we're very excited to see how that turns out.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark. Any other questions? I don't see anything in the Q&A tab. I think most things are coming in through the chat. Well, Mark, I want to say I really appreciated how you highlighted the importance of partnerships, collaboration, stakeholder involvement, and shared responsibility, and how prominent they are across the AQUEP standards. So thank you for shining a light on some of the most important aspects of our work. Really
Thank you. And if I could just make one last comment as we're wrapping up, and still the chat box is still open. Go ahead and put your questions in. I think, one of the things that's troubled me as a teacher educator for many years is what I view as a very narrow overlap between the discourse communities of educator preparation and especially education research and the discourse of professional practice in the schools. And I think we've gone a ways towards bridging that divide. We've gone a ways, but my hope is that accreditation, and if you saw all the ways that partnership links are there and connected, if we can really open the conversation. I'll just have one more story. It's from another national effort that I admire greatly. I was in a conversation, and I didn't check this with them first, so I won't mention what it is, but a group that's working across the country building stronger connections between schools and ed prep around residency issues. I was in a marvelous conversation, and we asked this question of a mixed group of higher ed and school-based people, and said, how do you interact around evidence? What do you share? And one of the superintendents from a large school district in the Midwest said, well, we've worked for years with IHE partners in educator preparation, and frankly, they're always asking for data from us, and we send it to them. And now, for the first time ever, we're actually having some conversations with them about it, but it's only because of this grant program. And so the question was, is it actually gonna keep going afterwards? And there was an evident sort of dissatisfaction from the superintendent saying, we're a source of information for people, we're a site of service, but is there really communication? Is it really about mutually learning together from data? His answer was not really, and nobody else in the Zoom windows gave any indication that they thought things were different. I don't think that the situation is as bleak as that story just made it sound. And I know that many of you who are in this session probably have very strong partnerships. And I go back to that turtle on the fence post things. I think there's a lot more going on that gets recognized or that gets appreciated. So I hope through your work in accreditation that you're able to, and I hope we as accreditors can support it, and please help us know how we can support that better, that over time, over the next few years, we're able to see some stronger bridges being built and seeing more two-way traffic across those bridges. One of my hopes with AQIP is that in 10 years, we'll have a really good and robust answer and a voluminous answer to this question. What have we all learned from accreditation lately? Not just individually, but what have we collectively learned from our quality assurance work collectively as a profession? And can we extend that circle to include our partners as well in the profession, which is exactly what they are. So, please help us in AQIP think more clearly about how to support that work, how to support you in that work as we continue to do that work together. So thanks for being here. Thanks for giving me a chance for that final word. So Ashley.
Thanks, Mark. That was a great way to end the session. A great vision and really powerful. Thank you.